I'm going to take Albert off of there real quick. But it's this is going to be a really fun hour with my good friend and honored guest, Governor Hickenlooper. A couple of other things I want to let you know about, and I think you remember him. Do you remember Walt from the Lumber Baron?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah. Walt Keller is going to be my guest next week on another Reinvention seminar.
He's perfect.
Yeah, it's really an incredible story. So for those of you here in Denver, you might remember Walt. He was the owner of the Lumber Baron Bed and Breakfast. And they used to do all these crazy, fun, theatrical murder mysteries and fun wedding type things. And he's on here actually right now. He's a North Denver kid. And a few years ago, and I'm not going to spoil his story, but he went out to LA and he decided he wanted to become an actor. And boy, has he ever become an actor. I mean, in just a couple of years he's been out there, he's been in, well, here's some of the bigger ones. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. He was in Ford versus Ferrari, Westworld, Big Little Lies 2, Hollywood, Lethal Weapon, SWAT, Silicon Valley, and a bunch of upcoming releases. And this was just his dream, his desire, and he went out and he did it. And it's going to be a really fun story to hear how somebody, really followed a passion and did something really incredible.
What happened to the Lumber Baron Inn? I've seen the house is still there.
That's a very good question. I don't know. I really don't know. I think somebody bought it. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about that next week. But he's a fantastic person, and I just love his story altogether. But let's get this started, John. I want to share something with you. We both knew Papa Jack Wild. Remember?
Oh yeah.
From Rock Mount Ranchburg, right? I think he was 106 when he died. Something like that. But he was born in 1901. So imagine this. If you were born in 1900, on your 14th birthday, World War I starts. And it ends on your 18th birthday. 22 million people perish in that war. Later, a Spanish flu epidemic hits the planet and runs until your 20th birthday. 50 million people die in those 2 years. On your 29th birthday, the Great Depression begins. Unemployment hits 25%. The world GDP drops to 27%. That runs until you're 33. The country nearly collapses along with the rest of the world. When you're 39, World War II starts, and you're not even over the hill. I mean, on your 41st birthday, the United States is fully pulled into World War II, and between your 39th and 45th birthday, 75 million people perish in the war. At 50, the Korean War starts. At 55, the Vietnam War starts. On your 62nd birthday, you have the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the tipping point in the Cold War. Life on our planet, as we knew it, should have ended. I mean, it was, great leaders prevented that from happening, obviously. Kennedy's assassinated, MLK is assassinated, Robert Kennedy, Watergate. When you turn 75, the Vietnam War finally ends. Now, I'm not saying all of this to, by any way, say that what we're experiencing isn't important, because it obviously is. And I'm not trying to diminish the effects this is having on the world and on people everywhere. I've known people who have died from this, from coronavirus. I think probably everybody has at one time heard or know somebody personally that has. And I heard a journalist who'd covered a lot of these types of things in the past, SARS and Ebola and things like that. And he said that was going to be really the big difference, is that everyone is going to know somebody who has died from this. But when you think about perspective, think about how all of these people survived, all the people that did survive. And not only that, it was just this incredible amount of resilience. So this is a long-winded question, but it's an important one because, in your book, which is if anybody has never read this, it's called The Opposite of Woe, My Life in Beer and Politics. Great book, great book. You talk a lot about somebody who is very, very special to you, and I'm going to show who that is right now. Do you see that? So, that's your mother. Yeah. And you talk so much about your mother, and I think it is not only a tribute to her, but it's a tribute to the generation of of people like her as well. And hold on here, my thing's going a little weird.
You notice in that picture, she's reading her detective mystery, which she loves, but she's standing up. That's how short she was. She claimed she was 5 foot. She wasn't quite 5 feet.
That's amazing. I mean, it really is. But can you talk a little bit about, you also shared a lot when you were in that book, and you talked a lot about the kind of struggles you've had in your life, and you certainly experienced your own level of trauma and different challenges. But you also turn a lot and you talk a lot about your mom, and she lived an amazing life of resilience as well, bouncing back from really challenging and traumatic events. But I've asked other people who've been on these seminars, what is it that helps you get through this stuff? What's your backup energy, the thing you tap into when you're facing struggles? I mean, is it the lessons from your mom? Is it family, faith, your own experience that helps you get through it?
No, it's a combination, but it is a lot of my mother. And, she was born in 1921. So she was a kid when the Great Depression started, right? She was 8 years old when it started. And then her father tried to start an apple brandy distillery in 1933 when they repealed the Volstead Act, the Prohibition. And, he thought he could make his apple brandy faster than the guys in Tennessee could make bourbon. He forgot that there was no prohibition in Scotland. And, the market was flooded with Scotch and rye whiskey from Canada. Anyway, he went bankrupt. She sewed all her own clothes. She was just a very gritty person. And then her first husband was a pilot in World War II. And after victory in Europe, the day before he's going to get discharged, he crashed and perished in just this tragic accident. And then she met my dad and had 2 more kids. And he got cancer. He died right when I was 8. And so she raised 4 kids by herself, but she never complained. And if we started whining, she would shut us right up. And she'd say, listen, you're never going to be able to control what life throws at you, but you can control whether it makes you a better person, right? Whether you find a way to get good out of whatever happens. And
that's the definition of resilience.
That is the definitions of resilience. And that's where, so I will try to channel her when that first term when I was governor and we had the droughts and then the wildfires and then the floods and the shooting. It felt like literally, I went to 34 funerals in those 4 years, and you just feel every morning, you feel like, oh my gosh, is this ever going to end? And those are the worst hard times when it feels like it's never going to end. But as you point out in your wonderful description of Papa Jack, it does. We're going to come through this. We're going to come out of it. When I got laid off, I came out to Colorado as a geologist. I had a company car. I thought I'd be a geologist my whole life. And then there was that commodities bust. All the commodity markets tanked in the 1980s. And not just my company, but hundreds of extraction, mining companies, oil and gas companies, hundreds and hundreds got consolidated or closed down. And I got laid off in 1986, along with about 10,000 other geologists in a 5-year period. So no one was hiring. Everyone was getting laid off. You thought there was no hope. And it was hard. There were 4 of us that all lived in a house together.
You talked about that in your book. You said, that, and I think this is true. I'm talking to dozens of job seekers every day, and many of them are, they're in their 40s or their 50s, and they've never not had a job. They've either gone from promotion to promotion, or they've moved to different companies and so forth. But you talk about how, geologist was your identity. And yeah. How did that feel when you got laid off? What do you remember the emotions, or was it?
Well, it's, and we got a severance. And so I think in many ways I was better off than many of the people today, because this kind of an economic catastrophe, many companies that normally would provide severance and support and, give assistance to try and help their former employees find new jobs. That's clearly not happening like it did. And so I did feel, I felt kind of lost and bereft, but I also, in a funny way, there's a little voice way in the back of my head that felt this was freedom. And that, you know, I had always had in the back of my head a doubt about whether I was a great geologist, whether I was ever going to be a really good geologist. I thought I was, and I'd go in and work on Saturday mornings, but it just what I always had that doubt, and it took a while. You know, I didn't actually start working trying to figure out how to open a brew pub for a while. And it took, you know, I was out of work for a long time. I don't care what your situation is. If you're used to being in a job and you're used to working, after about 6 months or 8 months, and I would warn everybody, it's like the 7-year itch in a wedding, right? You're always going to go through some turbulence after 6 or 7 or 8 years being married. You just got to have to work and be prepared for it. But after about 6 or 8 months, you begin to look in the mirror and see a different person. You don't appear to yourself as quite the same person. There's not quite the confidence. I don't know, confidence is such a big part of life that if you begin to lose that, I think it's really useful to try and find ways to build it back up. And if you can't, even to pretend. I mean, there were times I remember when I was trying to get people to invest in the brew pub. We had this idea, we were going to start a restaurant that brews its own beer. What a concept. Well, I mean, nobody had ever seen a brewery in the middle of the restaurant. My mother wouldn't invest. And sometimes I learned how to kind of fake it, you know, and you just pretend you're really confident, right? Of course, why wouldn't you invest? But that's it was hard for me, and I'm an extrovert. I think for some people it's really hard.
Well, you know, and it's interesting you bring that up because I think it is a lot about perspective. I shared this story a couple times in some of these seminars, but I'll never forget, I had this award-winning salesperson who came to me and he was really having a challenge finding a new job. And so I asked him, I said, okay, what are your challenges? And he started listing off all of these things. You know, my resume stinks. I'm overqualified for this. I'm underqualified for that. I don't know how to write a good cover letter. My interview stinks. Went through about 15 different things. And I finally stopped him and I said, all right, why should somebody hire you? What are the things about you that you should be hired? And it stumped him. And he had gotten to that point where, you know, you wake up and you look in the mirror and it's somebody that you don't recognize. And I told him, I said, look, sometimes it just takes an affirmation from others to remind you that all those things on your resume, all of those accomplishments, successes, the college education you might have, all of those things are real. And, you know, it can get to be a very, very difficult thing. I call it the job seeking quicksand, because you can fall into that very quickly. And then what happens is people tend to start dumbing down their resumes, or they start to write their resumes to ways that identifies them in a way that they see themselves when they wake up in the mirror, which is not fair to themselves either. So it can be really tough. You know, you talk about the wine coop. You didn't really set out to reinvent yourself. I mean, you went out to LA as well, and you know, tried to write some scripts for TV, and you know, but then you went to your brother Sid, who I've been to that house, and you discovered craft beer, right? And was that so? Go ahead.
When I got laid off, I took some of my severance, and I spent $4,000, which was, my mother thought I was crazy, but I'd always wanted to have a convertible. So this was in 1986. I bought a 1976 Chevy Malibu convertible, bright red with a white top, black interior. I mean, I still got it. It's out. It's in the garage, and I don't know. I just did it, and so I needed an excuse. So my brother was doing his roof at his home in Berkeley. And you met Sydney. He's 7 years older than I am, but he's always kind of been a half father, half brother to me. So I went out to help him, to pay him back for all the stuff he'd done for me. And at the third night, he took me to see a brew pub. And there was a Wednesday night. There was a line out the door on a Wednesday night, and we waited in line and we got the beer. And I said, "Gosh, it's not so fizzy. It's got more flavor." I drive 20 minutes out of my way to have a beer that tasted this good. And I didn't think anything about it. I never worked in a restaurant. I didn't think of myself as someone who should be in the restaurant business. And then I went to LA, and I had a friend who was the executive producer of Night Court. You remember that terrible comedy? And so he gave us, my girlfriend and I, lessons on how to write sitcoms. and we wrote some scripts, and we got one accepted right before they canceled the show, so it never got made.
No.
But when I came back to Denver and I looked for more geology jobs, I tried to think of other things to do. The idea that maybe a beer that made, or a restaurant that made beer on the premise and it was fresh, that was something that just, if it attracted me, it would attract other people, I thought. Unfortunately, it didn't attract enough investors. Took us almost 20 months to raise. We just had to raise 400 grand, but it's.
Well, let me stop you there for a second, because, okay, so you're coming back, you don't have a job, you have a little bit of severance left, maybe, you decide you want to start a business. I mean, a lot of people have these crazy ideas, I want to start a business, I want to start this. But even a restaurant, I mean, that's even crazier. I mean, a restaurant, particularly if you've not been in the restaurant business before, I mean, that's not for the faint of heart. I've worked in restaurants a lot, but you actually followed through, it's truly amazing. I mean, how did you know what to do?
Well, I've always thought in life there are two really valuable assets that most of us have and we don't appreciate. One is, if you've ever taken the time to follow your curiosity, and you see that the curiosity is a good thing. This whole notion that, curiosity kills the cat, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. But curiosity is the reason the cat has 9 lives. Because when you're curious, you find out the good things, the bad things, what the problems might be, but you know where to go to find information. So I went to the library and got out a book on how to write a business plan. Actually, my partner, Jerry Williams, went to the library. It was his idea to get the book. And then we kind of made our own business plan. And then the other asset that we have are the people we've gotten to know, the friends that we never intended to use them as a resource, but they're our friends, and they want us to succeed because they know us. And people so often underestimate that. And Patrick Ling and a guy named Rich Director owned the Pearl Street Grill. Uh-huh. And they allowed me to come up on a Tuesday morning when their accountant came in. And I spent 4 hours learning exactly, how much did it cost to buy the materials to make a lunch, yeah, and how much is labor, and how much do they pay for the rent, and how much is the utility. I could look at a real business and then take those numbers and move those numbers into our business plan. I would have never been able to raise the money without that, because I had never worked in a restaurant. I mean, that's the hardest thing. You start a new business, the hardest thing, if it's a really good idea, that means no one else is doing it or doing it the way you want to do it. And when I told my brother about the brew pub, that I came back, I said, I want to do this. He says, well, do you think it's a really good idea? And I said, yeah, I think it's a really good idea. He goes, well, if it's that good an idea, you better hustle. You better get going, because this is a big world. And if you think it's that good an idea, there are another 20 people in Denver that are thinking about it right now, and you want to be the first. Anyway, Patrick Ling and Rich Director and the Pearl Street Grill allowed us to go faster, to kind of, I didn't have to go out and be an apprentice for a year or two, which is what most people would do before they would start a business like that. You just go for it.
Yeah, you just go for it. I know I'm a big fan of the podcast, How You Built This. I don't know if you've ever heard it. And they always ask that question of people who've like started these amazing things. They say, well, how'd you know what to do? 9 times out of 10, they said, I had no idea. They figured it out. Or, you know, when a crisis happens in their business, how did you get out of that? You figure it out. And, a lot of it is personality. I mean, with you, because I know you so well, I can say this. I mean, there is a level of charisma, of personality, of salesmanship, of, that extrovert. You're not afraid to get out of any comfort zone and do what it takes to try and make something happen. And I think that level of positivity is just, incredibly helpful as well. But it is still scary. I mean, there has to be sleepless nights that go with that as well, in terms of, how, especially a restaurant. I mean, I don't have to tell you, the overhead in a restaurant is just off the charts. And, I just am so sympathetic, and I'm sure you are more, to what's going on right now with the restaurants in this city, in this state. It's just tragic.
It's so hard. And I remember lying awake at night, our first 2 years, sometimes like that, our first summer, everyone stayed home to barbecue. And we spend so much time trying to get people to come to lower downtown. The rent was $1 a square foot per year. And the reason the rent was so cheap was because people were scared of it. It was abandoned warehouse district. There was nothing going on there at night. And, you know, that first summer, everyone, it wasn't in their minds that this was a fun place to go. They just stayed home and barbecued with their friends. Our sales went down 20%. And all of a sudden I had to call my brother up and borrow money. And I lay awake at night trying to figure out how I was going to make payroll. And that's part of running or starting a business from scratch. I think it's true for almost everybody that, one, you have to work 80 and 90 hours a week, year after year. But the other thing is you have to, you know, you just are consumed with the business. And, you know, one thing today, you're describing the challenges right now. And I know so many restaurant employees and, you know, barkeeps and food runners and sous chefs. I mean, I've done every job in the restaurant at one time or another. And I really understand what a family it is.
Yeah.
And to see these restaurants close down and lay off everybody, it just breaks my heart. I can't even describe, because they'll never come back in the same way they were. And a community, a restaurant with a community of employees is just this magical organism, right? It's alive. It's like an ecosystem. The restaurant's an ecosystem, and these are all these organisms that interact and help each other, make each other stronger, and be optimistic. You know, when I remember early that first couple of years going in, and for a while I had a really cranky girlfriend, so I'd often go into work and I'd be a little cranky because we'd have had a disagreement, and I'd, you know, be cranky, and after maybe a couple of months, I noticed that soon the bartenders were cranky, and the sous chef was cranky, and the expediter on the food, getting the food on the plates was, if I was in a bad mood, other people became in a bad mood. So then I made this pact with myself, and I wish I'd done this when I was out trying to get investors, when I was trying to look for a new career. I would look in the mirror, right in the before you walk into the restaurant, there's that little vestibule, and you can kind of see yourself in the mirror, or in the window in the reflection. And I tried to put a little smile. I say, it's showtime. I put a little smiley face on, just so I'd go in there. And even if I was in a cruddy mood, I'd go in there with this kind of energy, and I try to force myself into it. And you know what's amazing? After a couple hours, 9 times out of 10, I'd be in a good mood. It was one of the most. Why did I have to wait till I was 36 years old to figure that out?
But again, I mean, everything you're talking about is also about resilience. And it's also talking about those triggers that, you know, we can define our situation by the crisis or by how we respond to it. And, you know, I think that, you know, the psychology of resilience is really how people look at the problem and say, how do we move forward? I'll tell you a funny story, because I think, but before I do that, hold on a second. I have this bright light that is just shining in my face. So that's a lot better. You know, I being quarantined with 3 kids and my wife, and we made a pact early on that if we're in a grumpy mood or if we start getting on each other's nerves, we created a safe word, and the safe word is pickles. So if anybody finds themselves getting upset or mad, anybody can use pickles, and we all go to a different room and cool down. And it's worked brilliantly. It's really helped.
That's such a good idea.
Same thing about the smiley face, you know, it's like.
You know, the other good trick that I learned in the restaurant business, which I think in constrained quarters like this works well, is when someone gets really angry or maybe just very cranky, repeat their exact words back to them, because it makes them feel heard and validated. This is what you do for unhappy customers. But it also, when you say somebody else's words that you've heard, when you hear their words, you think, here's what I think that means. But then when you say it back to someone, you hear it in a different sense. And it really is a funny, kind of a magical opportunity to hear people more deeply. And I think that's part of what we've got to do in this country, to get away from, you know, Republicans this, Democrats that, you're right, I'm wrong. You know, all those divisions, especially, you talk about resiliency in a crisis like this. We should be looking at how do we bring ourselves together, and what is the resiliency that we come away from this crisis.
We're all in this together. I mean, it doesn't matter. I mean, we all have to work together to pull out of this. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Well, I tell you what, that's folks out there, $500 worth of free marriage advice too, right there.
No, I tell you, when we had the floods was the first time I really understood resiliency. And the governor of Vermont had called me up. His name was Peter Schumann. Is that Schumann? Schumann. And anyway, he had floods 2 years before. And he said, the most important thing you can remember is when people have lost so much, you can't go back and say, I'm going to get you back to where you were. You've got to tell them you're going to go better. You're going to end up better. Once we get through this, you're going to be better off than you were before. And that is so true of people losing their jobs, of people. I mean, if you change your job, even if you're not laid off, if you're just planning to change your job, there's a huge amount of loss, right? And you have to kind of somehow process and mourn that loss.
True.
But when you lose your job, when you're laid off, you have the loss, and you also have all the disorientation, the financial pressures, and things like that. And I think that's really where you really need that resilience. You have to work on that. I'm going to come out of this better. I mean, and that's why I think a lot of the stories you told me about people, reimagining themselves and trying to figure out the right way to write a resume, and a different way to write the resume. This is that moment where, people have that chance to reinvent themselves.
Well, and I tell you, the other thing is I was talking to a woman earlier yesterday, and companies and organizations right now are trying to figure out how they're going to operate in a post-COVID world. And there's so many different issues out there, from employee culture, from hiring, from how do we keep people apart from each other. I mean, there's just a gazillion issues that are going on. And this woman I was talking to, she was telling me about, she was in HR, and she had worked during the Great Recession of 2008. And she says, yeah, sure, that's a lot of the issues that we had to deal with as a company. And my only point in all that is, more than just the skills and experiences that somebody brings to the table, they also have this history of helping solve problems and helping companies and organizations move forward during crises or during hard times. And it could have been during a downturn financially, it could have been something else, but it's another way for people to look at their background and their skills and saying, what value can I bring to a company that is going through something that is so out of the ordinary right now? And I would just say that to everybody. But let me ask you this question, because I know our time is limited. So you get the Wine Brewery, and I remember those days. I mean, it wasn't Lodo, it was Skid Row. It was there. There was your building, and I was about 3 blocks away, sneaking in to sit in at the El Chapultepec as a 18-year-old bass player. And I always thought that the El Chapultepec was the only thing down there. I mean, there wasn't even sidewalks. It was like dirt sidewalks. It was crazy. But in terms of you staked your flag in that area of town, and I'm always telling job seekers, one of the ways to consider your job search is to get out of your comfort zone and take some risks, do something different to get results and to get attention. How was it that the city ended up becoming part of the vision of what the Wine Coop was preaching? Because I mean, there was other businesses down there. There wasn't completely empty, but the Wine Coop, in my opinion anyway, was really the catalyst for all of that.
So many people for years have been talking about how Lodo was this potential, this locus of rejuvenation for the whole downtown. Because the downtown for 20 years, people have been moving down to the tech center in Southeast or up towards Broomfield, moving away from downtown Denver. But no one had ever really found a way to create a business that was really successful and would attract other businesses. So when we opened, and they had the Downtown Denver Partnership had what they called a lower downtown support office. It was half paid for by the city, half paid for by the Denver Partnership. And they helped me do my business plan. They introduced me to banks when I was trying to get a loan. They helped me get turned down by 32 banks. But the 33rd Women's Bank said yes. But anyway, there was an awareness of what we were trying to do was important. And when we first opened, and I say this to some of my friends who own restaurants, and they're worried about whether they're going to be able to hire all their employees back, whether they're going to be able to get their customers back, how long is that going to take? And one of the challenges we had, and I tell my restaurant friends this, people were so fearful of lower downtown, right? It was dark and scary. And so I planted myself by that front door. I mean, I lived by that front door every shift, every lunch, every dinner. If I wasn't there, I put my partner, the chef there, or Russ Share, or the partner who's the brewer. We tried to make sure that someone was there to reassure people that we're watching the parking lot, to make sure your car doesn't get trashed. We're making sure that we're doing everything we can to make you feel this is a safe place, and that you're in good hands. And I think that's true for businesses beside the restaurant business. I think all the retail businesses are going to have a certain amount of fear to deal with. I mean, it's not clear exactly. I don't think we're going to get a vaccine that fast. So we're going to have to get testing, and then, make sure that when someone tests positive, we can find out and trace who they've talked to and get people to isolate, so that we can have a pretty high level of confidence that we're not going to get sick again. Because who's going to go in and do a restaurant or a coffee shop or a hair salon if they're worried that they might get sick? And I think not just the owner of the business, but everyone who works in Rock Down Ranchware, everyone who works everywhere is going to have to go above and beyond in recognizing that their customers are a little bit, this is a new normal.
Yeah.
And we're going to create it together.
Steve even told me, he said, when people try on shirts now, he has to steam clean each one, after
Wow.
they put them. I mean, that's, they had a picture today in the Wall Street Journal of a guy who was, he was measuring for somebody's pants. He was a tailor, and there was a big screen behind him with just a little opening so he could do that. I mean, my sister and brother-in-law play in the symphony in Salt Lake, and they're obviously on furlough, but their biggest fear is twofold. Number one, are people going to be willing to sit next to each other to hear a symphony? And number two, are the musicians going to be willing to sit next to each other to play the music? And how do they do that safely? So it's, I mean, there's a lot of things that we're having to deal with out there. Okay, so let me move on, because this is an important part of your reinvention. When you started the Wine Coop, you also realized there's a huge responsibility, and you talk about this a lot in your book, to the community. So, it was, today they have fancy words called cause marketing, but back then, there's this genuine, authentic feeling that, you had a responsibility to the community at large. And as a result, you dove into a lot of community work, sitting on nonprofit boards and being part of government committees and commissions that were redeveloping that whole part of town. And you gave up the Wine Coop for fundraisers. I remember all of that. But I don't have to tell you, there's more than 20,000 registered nonprofits throughout the state of Colorado. And they're from everything from healthcare to seniors issues, to kids, to arts and culture, to job training. I mean, all kinds of stuff. And now more than ever, those nonprofits are going to be a safety net for so many people. Can you talk about why you're so committed to nonprofits, and what nonprofit organizations, what people can do to support them now?
Sure. And I do believe passionately that the source of most of our solutions is going to come from a combination of the private, the business sector, government, and then I call it civil society, but nonprofits. And I think in many cases, they're kind of the representatives of people. There's some person or group of people had an issue they cared about, and they formed a nonprofit. And in America, this is one of those weird things. We're one of the few countries in the world where our government gives a tax incentive, a tax deduction, if you donate to a nonprofit, to a 501c3. And that is such a powerful tool for this country. It allows people to be involved in their community. We're now that I'm still running for office, so they're going back over all the things we did while I was governor. One of the things that they're investigating is whether we took money from businesses and gave it to nonprofits. And, we had all these public-private partnerships. And certainly you always have to make sure that you're taking money, no one's getting any influence, right? We were religious about that to make sure that didn't happen. But allowing businesses that care about and want to get back to their community is so is so much a part of the core competency of America, that we are a place where businesses, if anything, we complain nowadays that businesses are just all about profit. So when they are trying to give donations to, well, I'll give you one example, and it just changed my world after we had the floods in 2013. I mean, the worst set of floods in the history of Colorado. And in September of 2013, Wednesday the rain started, then Thursday, Friday, Saturday was,
Oh, I remember. Yeah.
just awful. I mean, it was the worst floods in history. Sunday night, I got a call from a guy named John Hayes, who's the CEO of Ball Corporation, large company up in Broomfield, headquartered. And he said, I don't want to bother you. I know how busy you were. It was 9 o'clock at night. I'd just gotten off the phone, trying to figure out how we're going to get the roads rebuilt. And he said, I know you're going to have to raise a lot of money, and I know a lot of the businesses are going to have to do our part. I just want to let you know that we'll put in $1 million so that when you're talking to the other CEOs, you know that you can tell them, here's what the level is. That's what a top tier corporate citizen looks like in this crisis. And I mean, that makes all the difference. It made, it helped us raise money for the Victims Fund dramatically. I think we got many, many millions of dollars. And that, when I was trying to get the Wind Coop up and running and I was on all these nonprofit boards and committees, I'll be honest, part of it was I wanted to build networks and I wanted to have more people that might come to my restaurant. But I found as the weeks and months and years went by, that those meetings and being with people that weren't worried about getting a higher level of sales or cutting their costs or somehow improving their business, those people that were just thinking about the communal best interest, that those were some of the best parts of my day. And that's part of how, when you and a couple other people told me I should run for mayor, that was part of what was attractive about it. Was I'd had such positive experiences with community activists and people that, were running a nonprofit to deal with battered women or runaway kids or drug addiction. You go down all those lists. Those are groups of citizens. And I just love the idea of facilitating and trying to help them get the resources so they can do more good in our community.
Well, it's interesting you say all that because I remember our conversations about that. And when I went to Frontier Airlines, and part of my portfolio of responsibilities was the whole community relations side of it. And we gave out 3,000 airline tickets a year to nonprofits. And on top of that, we donated money, and we had different tiers of partners. Like we had our big partners that we would do a lot with volunteer-wise from our employee standpoint. And then we had second level tiers, and then we had the ticket giveaway. But I will tell you, every time when Frontier Airlines had a real presence in the community, these nonprofits would tell us that having us on their side opened up so many other doors, because it was like having those big companies out there supporting the nonprofit world, and them going to other companies, and then other companies are saying, well, if Frontier is doing this, there must be something to it. Why don't you come in for a meeting? I mean, but it's that whole connectivity that surrounds us when we approach it that way. So let me talk about your next step in your journey, because I remember, you might not remember this, but back in '94, I'd never met you before, and I was working as the head of communications for RTD, and we were about to open up the brand new light rail system, and it was a crazy time. We had a really fun board of directors. It was a tremendous testament for the city that it was just that 5.3 mile line, right? I mean, it was just from 5 Points to I-25 and Broadway. And I invited you to come take a ride.
Oh, right.
I knew who you were, because I'd heard about you and I knew what you were doing in Lower Downtown. I can say this, honestly, you were the first non-RTD person to ride the light rail back then in '94. But anyway, I remember your brand was somewhat, the mayor of Lodo. I mean, that's what people would used to call you. And, and I know there was a lot of other people that were, that were part of the development of Lower Downtown, but you really kind of were the primary force that established it as a destination. And not to go into all the details, but, ultimately you had a grassroots campaign to save the name Mile High Stadium for they were going to sell it to the highest bidder. This was a big taxpayer-funded stadium, and that didn't sit well with you. And you had this massive campaign to save the name that everybody got behind. I mean, if you were a pretty well-known brand in certain circles in lower downtown, but that really kind of put your name on the map. And I think half of it was people were just saying it out loud to see if they could pronounce it. Then there was a handful of knuckleheads who sat after a game and said, "Hey, you know what? We've got a great idea. Why don't you run for mayor?" And I remember driving you to the wine coop the night you won the election, and we were going to that big party. Take us to that moment that you won, and someone came in and said, "John, you're the next mayor of Denver." But what was that feeling? I mean, was it just relief? Was it fear? I mean, what was going through your mind when all of a sudden you never run for student council and now you're the mayor of Denver?
So, I love that. I almost never. I'm so focused going forward. I almost never look back and appreciate those moments. So I should, and this is a treat. In 1989, we'd been open for 6 months, and Mayor Pena's head of planning decided they were going to close down Union Station, eventually turn into a mall, and rip up the tracks so that the 16th Street and 18th Street could go out into the valley and they could develop the Platte Valley. And they were going to put the train station, all it was just Amtrak in those days. They're going to put it up at, I think it was going to be at 48th and Blake or something. Anyway, we put up these little petitions in the wine coop on the wall. It was SOS, Save Our Station. And we got 3,400 signatures in 6 weeks. And we persuaded the city to change their minds and to leave the station there just in case we might someday need a station, which is so funny. And then that whole notion around Mile High Stadium, which Luke Cady, one of the great marketers of all times, he was stirring the pot and got me involved in that. But it really was untapped resource that so many people cared about it. And all we had to do was give them a voice. And that night, when you were driving me to that unbelievable celebration, and it was, I would say honestly, if I was going to be brutally frank, it was half, blind excitement that we could come in and try and do things differently, and we had a mandate to I campaigned that we'd never be a great city without great suburbs, and that we were going to help the suburbs actively. People thought that was lunacy, right? The voters of Denver don't want to help Aurora or North Glen or Lakewood. Well, it turned out the citizens of Denver did want to, have a rising tide. So I felt we had that mandate, but I also know, I'd had a discussion with Michael Bennett 3 weeks before, and he asked me who I was thinking of to have as a chief of staff. And I didn't know what a chief of staff did. I was so clueless. They don't, if you're running a restaurant, you don't have a chief of staff. It's not a bad idea. If I had to do over again, I might. But there was that fear that I knew so little about, what the protocol was and what I was supposed to do. And yet I was so excited to be able to go in and to work, RTD, that, you planted a seed, because that was one of the things I campaigned on. And that's the first thing I did after I got elected. I went out and met with Mayor Tower in Aurora, and talked about how are we going to, can we get everyone together, all the mayors universally, all 30, at that time there were 34 mayors, to unanimously support building a comprehensive light rail system, right? 122 miles of new track. No other metro area before or since has ever done that. And yet, I was so excited about it, but I also, no one had ever done it. What if we fail?
Well, so I'll tell you, just from someone who was at RTD at the time, the idea, I look back at it now, and I see how far that has come. And, God bless Cal Marcella. I remember picking him up at the airport when he got hired, and, he was the ultimate compromise candidate. But he was such a powerful force, and, much like you, an extrovert, optimist all the way. Not, let's think about the problem. Let's think about how we can fix the problem. And I won't ramble on, but the fact is that the fact that we have so much light rail in the city today, no one would have believed that back in 1994. No one would have ever thought that that was even remotely possible in our lifetimes, let alone a train out to DIA.
Right. Or Union Station
Yeah.
being one of the national models of how to revitalize an old station.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is exciting. So, I asked Mayor Webb that question, what were you thinking when, you found out that you were going to be mayor? And he said he was scared.
Yeah, I was equally scared. There was a lot of fear.
Yeah, I mean, he said it wasn't. He said he was scared of messing up, which I thought was interesting because he's such a confident, big guy. But I think that's a very human thing when you're given that mandate.
One of the things that was, and I didn't realize how important it was as it went on. But during that campaign when I ran for mayor, it's partly because I knew you. I never criticized Mayor Webb. I mean, every other candidate was out there, because it was a way to get in the newspapers. It's like attack ads. You criticize somebody, and the newspaper or the TV station covers you, and that's how you get noticed and how you build your name ID. And I was determined not to do that, and it turned out to be the smartest thing I ever did because, I mean, the day after I got elected, or the day after I got inaugurated, it was the day after I got elected. Before I was inaugurated, Mayor Webb had me come in, and he sat me down, spent 3 hours walking me through the real city. In other words, all the agencies, what the problems were, what the successes were, what the failures were. It was just such a gift, and he was so supportive. I mean, I could clearly feel that he wanted me to succeed. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of people, when they're looking for work, now I'm going full circle, but we underestimate how often people, maybe we don't know them that well, but they want us to succeed. And if we ask them for advice, I mean, I tell my son Teddy, one of the most important things you can do when you're young and finding your way is ask for mentors. Ask people if they'll be willing to make a little time, just every couple months to have lunch or give you advice, because most people will say yes. And then once they get to know you a little bit, they'll be willing to invest themselves. They'll want you to succeed. And
yeah,
Mayor Webb was what a gift. I mean, that was, that's
a piece of advice I give to job seekers all the time. And it takes people out of their comfort zone. I mean, to a degree. I mean, it's like going up and asking somebody to invest their time and helping them out. But the opportunity when you have somebody that is going to be your cheerleader or who sees something in you is just amazing. And there's a lot of hidden jobs that aren't on job boards but they exist in somebody's mind, or they exist when you talk to them and show them what it is that you have to offer them. Go ahead.
But I think there's not a coincidence that almost every major religion in the world has it's some place right close to its core. There is you are sacred if you give of yourself to others. That giving to others. And so I think that's a genetic desire to help other people. So that's why, even though it's fearful for a lot of people to ask for that help, you're really doing a favor for the other person, right? You're allowing them to help you when you're really in need, and you'll be adding to their, to their strength and their level of joy.
Yeah. Hey, Matteo, come here. Matteo has been dying to say hello to you. So this is Matteo.
Oh my God, look how big he is. Hi, Matteo. Nice
He's 8 years old. He just turned 8. All right, buddy, go enjoy your pizza.
He's a giant.
Yeah, but it is you're absolutely right. And the other part about that is that the people you're asking for help, they've asked other people for help, so they get it and they understand it. And you're going to get the occasional person who doesn't call you back or just doesn't have time or whatever. But I tell you what, if you make 10 calls and you get 3 calls back, that's a great day. I mean, you ask any salesperson, that's a great day. Now, let me ask you about this, because running for office is the ultimate job interview. And it's a nonstop job interview. What can you share about your experience running for office that's relevant to job seekers? I mean, I always tend to think you got to be authentic, you got to be real, you got to be confident. But what are lessons that you've learned that are helpful in terms of getting people to be on your page?
And it's funny, the first political thing I went to, and Michael Bennett was helping me. We didn't know each other very well, but he was driving me to this a precinct dinner. It was a spaghetti dinner in Northwest Denver, up in Park Hill. And I went there and we ended up sitting and eating with one of the guys who had been around the Democratic scene for a long time. And I told him why someone with small business experience would be so good. And as we were driving away, Michael looked at me with a little smile on his face and he said, probably wouldn't have hurt you to ask them what their ideas were, or, ask them what they thought. And it was, that moment, that flipped the switch. And I think the same thing is true with a job interview. You're trying to perform and just put yourself forward to advantage. You want to look as good as you can. And sometimes you forget that other person who's interviewing you and is working on trying to figure out who you are, they have a life and they have ideas and emotions. And so part of a campaign, I am constantly trying to go, as far out as I can. Now I'm doing it all by Zoom, but I want to hear where people are and how are they dealing with COVID. We have for the last month and a half in this campaign, we're not going out and trying to get people to vote for John Hickenlooper. We have 250 volunteers, and they are texting and phone calling just citizens saying, "Are you okay? Do you have enough food? Do you need to know where your food bank is close at hand? Can you make your rent?" And we're collecting the stories. We call it Share a Story. And I feel, you're right, it is just like a job interview. I feel more comfortable in presenting myself and talking about my vision of what we should be doing, what Washington how it should behave, what it would look like. I feel more comfortable feeling more in contact with all the people of Colorado, and especially the people that are, they're going through their worst hard time of their entire lives and trying to help them.
Yeah.
And I think too often when people are on a job interview, it's all about you. And if you get a chance, ask questions if they ask an interesting question to you, just say, "Does that sound crazy? What's your thought on that?" And I think that the deeper the conversation gets in any job interview, the higher the probabilities that they're going to want to work with you.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been on so many job interviews and I've consulted for companies on job interviewing and stuff. And usually what happens is the person who gets the job offer is one of those 3 finalists who, the panel of people, they're meeting with everybody and they're writing down madly the answers to the questions. But the person who gets the job interview is when that panel drops the pens and they're nodding their head, and all of a sudden that interview is a conversation. It's not what you would think of as an interview. It's a conversation. It's back and forth. And people start getting those aha moments in their heads, and they start to understand where you're coming from. And you can tell right away. And the reaction afterwards is usually unanimous with the people that were in doing the interviewing itself. Tell me about your time running for president. I mean, when you sat down and you were talking to people at the dinner tables, what were the dinner table issues that surprised you, or what were they telling you then? I mean, I'm sure it's going to be a lot different today than it was even 3 months ago. But
sure. Well, I'm sure it'd be much different today than 3 or 6 months ago. That was, again, we didn't get the results we wanted. So I tell my wife, Robin, I did get to 2% in multiple polls. The conversations we heard again and again were, I call them knife and fork conversations. In other words, what is it that you've done and that you want to do for this country that will affect the security and the welfare and the future of my family? And they care about the community, they care about the country, but people again and again ask those questions about their localized problems. So they cared tremendously about healthcare. That was the first thing, whether I'm in New Hampshire or South Carolina or Iowa, healthcare first. But it rarely was it about Medicare for all, there were people cared about that, and that would come up. But what they really cared about was the cost of their premiums, the co-pays and how much that was going up, the cost of prescription drugs, that they were worried that if they got sick, and they had a cap, let's say, on their healthcare, that they'd end up in bankruptcy.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting to recognize that there are a lot of people that care passionately about Medicare for all, that care about one solution or another. But generally, most people care about the common values. Should healthcare be a right, and not a privilege
Right.
for wealthy people? And it's interesting because you end up, when you're in Iowa, you're talking to Democrats, but you're also talking to moderate Republicans come to these meetups, and you're talking to independents. And I think more and more, certainly the feel I got was that we passed that line of no return, that we are on our way to universal coverage. And certainly COVID has only accelerated that understanding. But the meat and potatoes, knife and fork type issues were the ones that the ones that came up the most, and the ones I liked the most, because I love that level of policy, the granular, boots on the ground policy.
Yeah. I've only got time for a couple more questions, but I wanted to have you talk a little bit about CareerWise, because it just seemed to me that is such an amazing program that you established as an apprenticeship program for high school kids. But it seems like it's it's one of those timely, relevant things considering what we're all going through. I mean, the Civilian Conservation Corps that was established during the Depression, that built all those massive public works programs. It's
Red Rocks.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about what CareerWise was and your thoughts on that.
Sure. And I've got to mention Noel Ginsberg, because he came to me in 2013, I think, and said, I've got a plastic injection molding company and I can't find employees. And I've been studying this system that we see in many parts of Europe. And, the one he was really kind of sold on was a kind of combination of the Swiss system and the Swedish system, where kids get to choose. But this notion, and this is, until he sat down with me, I'd heard the statistic, but I didn't understand that, 70% of our kids, and in many places, 75% of our kids are never going to complete a 4-year degree. And yet we've been telling everyone they've got to go to college. And the truth is, if you give people skills, they can have incredible lives. They don't need a college degree. You look at all these advanced manufacturing facilities, someone's got to manage those robots and all the automation. And when it crashes, you've got to reboot it. Those jobs require skills, and you have to keep getting your skills updated every year. I think the future is going to be constant learning. But what CareerWise did was say, instead of spending those last 3 years in high school bored out of your mind and you don't want to go to college for whatever reason, CareerWise allowed you to go work when you're 16, 2 days a week. And then the next year you could work 3 days a week. And then your senior year, you could work 4 days or 5 days a week. And the days when you weren't working, you still go back to school, but you learned things that were directly designed to make you more successful where you worked. And kids love it. Businesses love it. I mean, in a funny way, businesses are actually, it's like they're voluntarily paying more taxes because they're taking on some of the burden of educating our kids. And yet it is, I think, as we scale it, it's now in 22 states.
Wow.
As we,
I didn't know that.
I mean, it just is a good idea whose time had come. And I think the way Noel helped us do it in Colorado it really has become a national model. And I think that's the kind of thing that really, as we come out of this crisis, that's the kind of resiliency where we should be able to embrace apprenticeships on a nationwide basis. It's not Republican, it's not Democrat. We should all buy into that. We should have 1 million apprentices a year, and everyone would benefit. The kids would benefit, the corporations and businesses would benefit, and society would benefit.
Well, and you think about manufacturing on one hand, but also in healthcare. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that people can be doing, learning skills that you don't have to be a doctor to be in healthcare. I mean, there's a lot of things that people could be doing. Last question, and you led Denver out of the Great Recession of 2008. Denver became, as a result, one of the most dynamic economies for a large city. And then the state of Colorado, I mean, that's just kind of legendary, where we became what was the #1 economy in the country. What lessons did you learn from that in terms of resilience from a community, and resilience in terms of going to business leaders and going to community leaders and, getting people to vote and getting people to support things. I mean, what lessons did you learn, and what lessons can be applied to what we're going through now?
Well, and that is the right question to end on, because I think it's directly applicable to what we're facing as we come out of COVID. And I think it's going to be a lot of work for all of us. When I got elected governor in 2010, we were 40th in the country in job creation. And we were, the turmoil out of the crash of 2008, we were just having a hard time rebounding. And what we did is exactly what I think the country has to do. We went to all 64 counties, and we didn't just talk to the economic development, professionals or the Chamber of Commerce folks. We talked to the librarians and school teachers. We talked to people that were in the healthcare side of things, the small retail business. We got everyone to sit down and spend a few hours trying to imagine what they wanted in their county, what they could imagine 25 years or 50 years from now as the industries, the types of businesses they wanted, and how could the state help them. And we did this all over the state. We created 9 regional plans, finally got to one statewide business plan. We called it the Colorado Blueprint. But the process we called the bottom-up economic development plan. And, most of the stuff was pretty traditional, to be honest. If you look at get rid of red tape and bureaucracy, better skills training, even before career-wise. People need better skills, better access to capital, a new emphasis on technology and innovation. I mean, all these things. Market the state not just as a tourism destination, but as a place where a young entrepreneur might want to come. And as we put that business plan in place and tried to push it out through every agency of the state government, the thing I realized, and I think part of the reason it worked so well, I mean, the last 3 years, U.S. News and World Report ranks Colorado the #1 economy in the country for three years straight, but it was because we were united, right? Because we went to everybody, Republicans and Democrats, big corporations, small businesses, and we took the time to listen. And I think that's part of the resiliency of what this country should be looking at as we come out of this, the recession that's going to be the consequence of this pandemic. We should be trying to say, we want everybody involved. Let's figure out how the system can be better. How do we create a middle class that's expanding instead of shrinking?
Right.
And then let's be united and make sure that we're all going to implement it. And honest to gosh, I think we can do it. I sound like an entrepreneur, so optimistic.
No, I agree. And I think that people are going to look at this time and saying, is this the opportunity where we come together as opposed to splintering off into different camps? This is the time where we all got to roll up our sleeves. I mean, just like the beginning of this conversation, like generations of us before did so well and built the country that we've enjoyed so much. But you're absolutely right. I was going to, lastly, it's too bad I didn't ask you earlier because you wrote this wonderful song about mail-in balloting and you played it on the I'll get my string bass out and you can pull out your banjo.
If I had any brains, I should have gotten you to record separately the bass line.
Yeah.
And you could have been on that recording. We're going to do more stupid songs like that, I promise.
Yeah. Well, if you haven't seen it, go to Hickenlooper's Facebook page and you can see it. It's very good. And actually, I was waiting for the punchline. Then it's about mail-in voting. That's a great one. All right. Well, hey, thanks again for doing this. I know we went a little bit over time, but I really appreciate it. And I know that everyone out there who's watching appreciates this as well. Just as a reminder to everybody, next Wednesday at 10 a.m., we're going to have Walt Keller on as part of this Reinvention series. He's the former owner of the Lumber Baron Inn, who many people know here in Denver, but now he's a famous Hollywood actor in LA. He's doing a lot of different things out there. It should be a lot of fun to hear his story and his adventure. So thanks again. I really appreciate you doing this, and it's so good to see you, and be safe and be healthy.
No, it's fun. Tell Walt I said hello.
I will.
And my love to your family.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
All right, good to see you.
Yep.